right. Do you mind checking on your phone?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Not seeing anything.
Not seeing anything on my page?
Oh, on your page, right? I should do that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Sweet.
Full screen.
Let me see. Oh, I can't seem to see. Oh, I see people are joining like that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good then. Good. Mm. You know what? I'm gonna text John to make sure that link is gonna work. Well, it says who joined. That's good.
Mm-hmm. Button mash.
Good to know the audio works as well.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, good to see you in. I'll probably give it until about 5 minutes past 1 o'clock, just to make sure at the beginning of this presentation. And of course, if 105 rolls around and no one's joined, that's fine. Give it anyway. Alright, 1 minute to go. We have 4 people watching. That's a pretty considerably good number considering this is my first presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mind that at all.
See?
5 people now, that's good. Hope everyone's having a very good day. All right. Well, I think now is a good time as any to start the presentation. My name is Carrick St. Laurent. I am currently I'm a student at Plymouth State University. I'm going for anthropology, majoring in anthropology. And I've been involved in cryptozoological research actively for around 4 years now, but it's kind of been a lifelong interest of mine, which makes it being a passion slash career path rather interesting actually. And it's kind of how I stumbled upon to the particular concepts that I would like to analyze with you today. So I'm presenting this presentation called The Lizardman and Cryptoconnectivity, an analytical example of scientific versatility in cryptozoology. Now, scientific versatility being a very key set of words there, and we'll find out why this presentation goes onward. Obviously, most of you having the same sort of interests that we have as people in this group and in this festival, we are obviously probably all familiar with the story of the Lizardman. And here's a rather dramatic but very nice depiction of what many people describe when they talk about seeing the Bishopville Lizardman. And of course, for those who are maybe less familiar or would like to become more familiar, just to kind of clarify what they know about it, I'll give you a brief rundown. So the Bishopville Lizardman is it's a cryptid reported from the town of Bishopville in Lee County in South Carolina. Here's actually a map of South Carolina with Bishopville's county, Lee County, highlighted in red here. So it's a rather small county, and it's not particularly well populated either. It's a rather rural place that one wouldn't expect necessarily to see something like this occur in. And of course, like many other stories of what would you say? Well, not to quote the company, but of small town monsters, it's rather unexpected but charming to some extent, but also quite scientifically interesting, and that'll be the highlight of this presentation going forward. Our first witness in this case, his name was Christopher Davis. He unfortunately passed away a number of years ago in a shooting incident. He was a teenager when he reported seeing this rather strange animal near Scape Ore Swamp, which is on the edge of Lee County, closest to Bishopville, which is hence the name Bishopville Lizardman, and sometimes it's also called the Scape Ore Swamp Lizardman, Lee County Lizardman. It's a very geographically oriented creature, mostly because it doesn't really appear in the local mythology much outside of Lee County, at least in South Carolina it doesn't. So here we have a news article, actually, from 1988, in July, which is roughly the month that Christopher Davis had his sighting. I actually believe that it was June that he reported it in July, or about 2 weeks after it allegedly happened. And here we have a photo of Chris Davis when he was that young. And here we have Lee County seeks lizard with bad attitude. Christopher Davis recounts experience with alleged 7-foot-tall lizard. So, obviously it's already a very strange report. Now, what Chris Davis reported is even stranger than the headline. He had reported that he was fixing a tire, and he was parked on the side of the road fixing this tire, and he was along the edge of the swamp when this occurred. It was in the evening, and this large animal rushed out of the swamp and actually charged him. Christopher Davis had just finished fixing his tire, according to the story he gave police, and hopped into the car and sped off, but not before the creature was able to do substantial damage to the car. Now, nothing that could break down the car, but something that is definitely, you could argue, the sign of an aggressive animal attack of some kind. And when Chris Davis went to the sheriff's department, he was asked to draw what it was that he had allegedly seen, and this is his sketch here. It's a rather rough sketch, I suppose you can call it. He's not particularly artistic, or I should say he wasn't, may he rest in peace. But that this was what he had seen. He didn't necessarily, although he would swear up and down this is what he had seen, he didn't try necessarily, as far as I know, to make a definitive claim as to the identity of what he saw. He had claimed he'd seen what he'd seen, and that was all there was to it for him. It's also worth noting that the sheriff was actually quite impressed by Christopher Davis's, what would you say, diligence in drawing this, because the moment he was asked to draw it, he was very committed to it. He grabbed the nearest piece of paper, grabbed the nearest pencil, drew it right away, and handed it to police. He had this image in his mind before he set out to draw it, so he had clearly, if this was a hoax even, he had thought this out quite thoroughly before he was asked to present this anecdotal form of evidence. And here we have a more kind of fleshed out piece of art that's based on Christopher Davis's drawing. This actually appeared in another newspaper, Lizardman Big Business in Lee County. So it becomes this cultural icon, this local cultural icon for the area as the years go on. And of course, if anyone's been to Lee County, and especially been to Bishopville, you'll see that. It's rather quite self-evident, actually, how embedded this story is into the local culture. It's so embedded into local culture, in fact, that it becomes embedded into the surrounding culture. So the story evolves over time, and even evolves to explain itself prior to the initial Chris Davis report. Here on the far left, we have another newspaper clipping from after Christopher Davis published his report of another person saying that before Christopher Davis had his encounter, just a few days prior to it, they too had their car attacked by some kind of, we'll call it in this case, a lizard man, because Christopher Davis and other witnesses described this kind of bipedal, green, scale-covered being. And of course, as it fleshes out itself into, like fan flames, kind of, into the widespread culture of the area and surrounding areas, you get, new forms of evidence. So up here in the top right, you have this piece of footage find online. And so we have one here of this silhouette in Skateboard Swamp. And of course, we have shows like Destination Truth, which was a very popular, roughly around 10 years ago. And they even have this 3D rendering of the kind of thing that people, again, describe when they see a lizard man, or when they're convinced they've seen a lizard man. And as you can see, it kind of differs a bit from Christopher Davis's drawing, which is, again, probably, if not most likely, a fleshing out of the culture and different interpretations kind of mixing together, whether or not they're real interpretations or misgiven ones. Now, considering that we're kind of a bit more familiar with this case now, let's say that you're a resident of Bishopville or Lee County, and you are out there, you're kind of walking around out there at night, and you are near the edge of Skateboard Swamp, let's say. And it's dark, and you shine your flashlight out there. And let's say you see something akin to this as you shine your flashlight out there. Now, I don't think it would be what would you say? I don't believe that it would be a wild assumption to say that many of you would immediately think to yourselves, I've just seen the Bishopville Lizard Man. And, really, who can blame you? Because this is quite, this matches, except for some anatomical details, what you'd expect to see from a quote-unquote lizard man. Now, I'd like to take a bit of a field trip, let's say, into the Triassic period, which is a period of time we define as happening around roughly 251 and 201 million years. Here is a rendering of the Jurassic period. It's very interesting geography, covered by these kind of large, slender, tapering trees. A great, wild and spectacular, something you'd see in Florida or something like that to these days. And equally fantastic is the fauna of the area. You have these kind of proto-dinosaurs, these and they dominate the landscape. Everything that dominates this landscape is rather quite impressive. And this is roughly what we would expect to see if we glanced into the Triassic period. Now, here we have a more comprehensive list of the kind of animal you would expect to see in the Triassic period. We have many of them are reptiles. Some of them are mammal-like reptiles, but most of them are these kind of either crocodilian or, again, proto-dinosaur reptiles, which is to say that they're pre-dinosaur reptiles that are quite saurian in nature. And, they're really quite impressive animals, all of them. And one of the most interesting of these animals, and one of the most least talked about of these animals, is one that we refer to as Carnufex Carolinensis. Carnufex Carolinensis meaning the Carolina butcher. Here we have some depictions of Carnufex, and Carnufex is really interesting because you'll notice immediately all of these are of a two-legged animal, some of them a bit more fantastically described than the others. We have what would you say? A rather not so fantastical looking as you'd expect to see in a prehistoric reptile's skin pattern, but still, quite impressive rendering of it in the top left corner. Near the center top, you have this almost more Jurassic Park sort of looking Carnifex that has many of these crocodile and alligator features. It looks very robust. It's lean forward. It's very intimidating. It's very fast looking. Very, very, thick tail, hunched over back. And then you have these two sort of paleo art, these sort of modern paleo art interpretations in the bottom left are certainly aiming more at, well, these things are a bit more fantastical usually than we usually depict them as. So let's give them these fantastical skin patterns, and they're really quite impressive because aside from the one in the lower center, which is mostly correct except for the legs actually, this is what we would expect to see if we were to see a Carnifex. This kind of mottled or striped bright colors with this these sort of ridges along the head and the back. And, of course, the standout feature of all of this being that it's walking on two legs. Of course, it works on two legs differently depending on which interpretation you're looking at. Again, the most accurate actually being the one at the top left here. This is our most accurate representation that we can tell so far of what Carnifex would have looked like. Now, Carnifex is quite interesting, because Carnifex is actually a crocodilian. It is a member of the same family as crocodiles, and it is an ancestor of modern crocodiles. And what's so stunning about Carnifex actually isn't its posture, but the fact that it is one of the most different crocodilians that we have ever seen in the fossil record, which is massively impressive, because crocodilians have remained the same for roughly, 100 million years or so, and, with these same, but then you have this branch off here that's actually quite different, which, again, very impressive. So, what exactly am I trying to suggest by explaining Carnifex and Lizardman in this? Well, to understand that, I'd like to introduce you to this concept. This is a metaphysical web. It's a metaphorical web, is more accurate. And at the center of this web is cryptozoology, conceptually. But surrounding it is also all these other concepts, scientific concepts like anthropology, geography, psychology, wildlife biology, zoology, technology, everything that could possibly be related somehow to cryptozoological endeavor is connected to it by this metaphysical web. And each of them are also a nexus because they actually exist at the center of their own webs as well. And all of those webs branch out into infinitely more webs, and there are actually roughly probably infinite cross points between each webbing line. And this is a concept I like to call crypto-connectivity. Not only because I use it in cryptozoology, but because it's these connections between scientific fields that are rather unnoticed. They're unseen, they're not paid attention to. The idea being that there are connections between fields of science that are not only existent, they're actually quite necessary to understand fields of science in general. For instance, I'm not sure that you could understand a certain culture, let's say a tribal African culture, without having a good understanding of not only geography but also of human psychology. That doesn't seem like that's the case. So these are very interesting points to make, that you can actually use other scientific fields to better understand the fields themselves. And so we'll be examining the Lizardman under that kind of lens today. We'll be using this sort of interpretation that this is in fact something that can be a nexus at the center of a web of scientific fields and can be looked at under a scientific scope. The main scientific subjects we're using today are actually going to be paleontology, a bit of maybe osteology, and wildlife biology / environmental sciences. So, we'll start with paleontology. Let's see if we can understand this case better through this. Now, it's a bit strange, an idea to call the Lizardman similar to Carnifex, because, of course, going off of these two drawings, which, the one on the left is quite more similar to Chris Davis and other reports, they don't really look the same, but maybe they're similar. Maybe they're not the same, but maybe it's good to have an understanding not of the idea that maybe Lizardman's Carnifex, because I'd actually not like to suggest that. I don't think it's viable to suggest that Lizardman is a surviving Carnifex. That takes too many assumptions into a positive light. Instead, I would like to argue that we know a similar animal to the Lizardman, many of them in fact, Carnifex being maybe the most similar, existed beforehand, and having Now, of course, Carnufex being our main example because it's so interesting of creature, and it's the closest thing we have to a lizardman in the fossil record. Here we have a reconstruction of Carnufex's skull. The highlighted bits are actually the bones that we do have, and the dull bits are the ones that we have to reconstruct hypothetically based on the bones. And it's as far as we can tell, quite accurate. We actually do have some of these little bones that confirmed what our hypotheses were. For instance, you see one of the teeth here is highlighted, and that seems to fit quite well with what our interpretation was of Carnufex's jaw. So it's actually quite comprehensive, this hypothetical piece. And this animal, this predator, worked within this highlighted blue range right here in North Carolina. So interesting to note, very close to Lee County geographically. It had this very narrow range, which is interesting. That might suggest that it was a very specific kind of animal that wasn't really much elsewhere. You had many similar creatures that lived in similar environments. Again, we have this wonderful piece of Triassic period art. And Carnufex, not being one of the predators in here, was still a Triassic period predator, and was very similar, in many ways, to other predators at the time. For instance, Postosuchus, one of the most well-known Triassic kind of proto-dinosaurian predators, was very similar to Carnufex, and really was quite an impressive animal as well. But there was one thing that kind of sets aside Carnufex from the rest of these predators, and it's that Carnufex had a very interesting kind of locomotion. It might have even been built for the same kind of environment that we see here, which is actually, this being a South Carolina swamp, not being too far off from Triassic period geography, it had adapted in specific ways that we can actually infer from the skull reconstruction, which is that, and you can see the definition here, Carnufex was what's called a facultative biped. This comes from a French word, and facultative meaning occurring optionally in response to circumstances rather than by nature. So this is one of those adaptations where we tend to see a choice on the part of the animal being integrated into behavior over time is probably the right way to look at it, which you could argue, too, is kind of how evolution happens, but not always. This is actually rather specific. It's rather choice-specific. You can't have a facultative feature that isn't choice-specific, so that's kind of where the line is drawn there. And, of course, biped meaning 2 feet. So, essentially, the word facultative biped, or the term facultative biped, means an animal that is bipedal, not by its anatomy, by definition, but by its own choice and the option it has to be a biped occasionally. And here we have an image from paleoartists that is referred to as Carnufex. And Carnufex is, of course, a funny title, but it actually is a very interesting image because it portrays the kind of bipedal nature Carnufex probably took on. And it's actually very, very good at integrating, or I should say it was very good at integrating, different kinds of locomotion into its behavior. So we see here, especially the female Carnufex is actually very well built for quadrupedal movement, and so is the male, but the male is demonstrating that this bipedal stance is actually something it can do rather easily, especially if it has support. Now, not all reptiles actually need support to be bipeds facultatively. In fact, it's likely that Carnufex didn't need it either. Granted, Carnufex probably wasn't a biped all the time, but it running after prey was probably something that happened quite often. And of course, you don't really have moving support with you, so it was actually quite, what would the word be? It was good at adapting that way. It was good at adapting to running on 2 legs. Now, of course, the question being, how do we know? And the answer is the skull. The skull is how we know. So, skulls and bones and fossils are very, very helpful in understanding the anatomy of prehistoric creatures. And, of course, that's kind of an obvious statement. But what's not obvious is exactly how. And the answer is something, I suppose, like speculative biology. And what that means, necessarily, is there are modes of creatures. There are types of animals on the planet. And it seems to be the case, as we study more and more animals, extinct and still existing across time, that there are types of bodies that don't tend to really fall out of a particular range of traits that they possess in order to function. So there's a range. There's not necessarily an infinite range, but there is a range. And this range can actually be referred to and looked at it and said, ah, this animal has this kind of bone, that would infer, potentially, this kind of trait, which would make the body look something like this. And as it turns out, this is actually quite a reliable practice. That kind of practice is the reason why bones like this can be built into something like this, and then more anatomical discoveries that aren't linked to our hunches about things, but are linked rather to more definitive evidence, confirm that skeleton's appearance and allow us to make representations of them like this. So Carnufex we know was a biped because of the way the skull is oriented, because we knew a spine that could be a biped would have been useful, particularly for that kind of skull. And again, the same process. The bones make the skeleton, and further findings confirm the skeleton would have made the body look a certain way, or operate perhaps even a certain way in the case of Carnufex. And of course, that results in our interpretation of Carnufex being something akin to this, which again, as far as we can tell, is actually quite accurate. So perhaps if we're talking about a Carnufex-like creature that could be, potentially, called a lizardman, maybe we're looking at something akin to this image here, this kind of, this semi-biped walking through a swamp. So that's our and again, why they would certainly be called lizard men if one person were to see them in their environment in the modern day, using their bipedal features actively. So there's a paleontological, look at the lizard man, why a lizard man might be the way that it is. And we are now going to look a bit more into the general wildlife biology of the lizardman, which tends to include things like animal sign, the diet, the climate of the area these animals might exist in, and what that might actually say for the credibility of the claims of these animals existing. What's interesting to note is that here we have an image of Skateboard Swamp, actually. And Skateboard Swamp, if you've ever seen more photos of it, which you will see in the presentation, is actually really quite similar to Triassic period swamps. The same plants don't grow there, the same type of trees don't grow there, but the general terrain is quite similar. And it's interesting to note that Carnufex dwelled in North Carolina swamps, as far as we can tell. So Carnufex and similar animals, therefore, would have been quite used to a place like Skateboard Swamp. Now, of course, the question of climate comes up, because the question of climate is actually quite an interesting one when you consider reptiles, specifically because reptiles are cold-blooded. They have to meet certain conditions to survive. So here we have a short little snippet of Triassic general temperatures. The temperatures of the Triassic period were, considering the range of Carnufex, probably between 50 and 60 Celsius daily, which, for those of you who are not sure what Celsius would mean, that's about 122 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit every single day. Perhaps at the height of the day, let's say. That's the average, which, blazing temperatures. That's quite hot. And here we have a rather comprehensive diagram of modern-day South Carolina temperatures. This is from 1971 to 2000, so this is actually quite a long span of time to be looking at this. So we see that the highest average temperature was roughly about 94, we'll call it, 94, 93. The lowest was about 75. That's lowest for the highest points that it could get during the summer. In the winters, it actually gets rather cold, and, those aren't so good for reptiles. So we have between a roughly 32 and 1 degrees Celsius to understand that. Of course, the previous temperature is being referred to in Fahrenheit. So we have this kind of weird contention now, where, okay, well, the geography and the paleontology suggest that an animal like this could exist. Temperatures that don't quite meet the same requirements that we should be meeting here. We have one that seems a bit too cold, especially for a large predator reptile. Now, there are a few holes, let's say, in this notion, in this analysis, because we do have to take into consideration the type of geography that is being given in these average temperature readings. is a subtropical region, meaning, roughly, that the animals that would have existed in the Triassic period that were like Carnifex in that area would have been adapted for a subtropical environment and not a tropical one. And, here we have a diagram of actually Florida's, which is a more tropical area, their common temperatures. And these common temperatures are actually, they're much higher than South Carolina's temperatures, which animals that live down in that area. We have, crocodilians that live in that area, alligators live in that area. So we do have evidence that these types of animals can exist in different kind of environmental and climatological ranges. So even though there's kind of holes in the idea either way, it's kind of hard to tell what role climate would play in something like a Carnifex-like lizardman actually existing. It's a bit unclear. The answer is still a big question mark. So unfortunately, while we have to leave climate at that, we can far more accurately discuss diet. This is a Lystrosaurus. It is a very mammalian reptilian kind of creature. It was about 3 feet long, maybe 4 feet long, so it was rather large, but probably no larger than a small bear. And it's quite a looker, this creature. But this creature and smaller reptiles, perhaps like this one, which were both Triassic animals, by the way, would have been the kind of animal you would expect the Carnifex to be feeding on. These kind of large creatures and these easy-to-catch smaller creatures as well. Excuse me. Now, we know that North America, which is, of course, where South Carolina is populated to the extent with very, very suitable candidates for a diet for Carnifex. Everything from deer, to hares, to otters, to possum, to wolves, to foxes, even, again, to small bears, raccoons. Much of this, very, very much of this, would have been a very good substitute for something like Lystrosaurus. This would have been the modern Carnifex's diet. And as it turns out, the swamps of North America are actually very populated with exactly the right kind of animals. Here we have from nhpbs.org an excerpt that reads, "Mammals like the raccoon, black bear, white-tailed deer, bobcat, red fox, and river otter make the swamp their home." And of course, we also have the notion that alligators also make these swamps their home, and alligators and crocodiles are very similar, and they both exist in relatively similar climates. So we have a very good notion that a Carnifex-like animal would be rather at home, dietarily at least. And of course, Skateboard Swamp itself is about 96 square miles, so that's a lot of room for something like this to exist. And if we're going to talk about a small population, which normally would actually be quite an issue, because small populations don't tend to actually exist very often in the animal kingdom. Most animals that are well fleshed out are also well fleshed out in number. But we must also remember that Carnifex, as we can tell, had a very small range, and it could be that that was the only existing population of Carnifex. Exactly how many individuals that range constituted is not known, but it's a considerably small one. So perhaps we're to take that into consideration. There's also the fact that crocodilians, being, these kind of quadrupedal animals, as we've also discussed in the Carnifex image, that these things aren't walking on 2 legs all the time. They walked on 4 legs, very low to the ground, so brush would hide them. And it's even possible that they were swimmers, or perhaps just waders. And, this makes it very hard to see one of these things. Let's say if you're a person walking into Scape Ore, and you're new, so they're kind of hiding from you as a lot of, we'll say, Carnifex-like lizard men. And now, of course, we have to talk about animal sign as well. And the phrase is kind of one that's more familiar with wildlife biologists than it is with most people. So I'll give a brief rundown. Animal sign is any trace of an animal's presence in the area it's been in. This can range from eDNA to the tracks it leaves, the scat it leaves, hair, skin, the animals it's eaten, the kills it leaves behind, the young at least behind, nests, anything like that. And unfortunately, the evidence for Lizardman sign is rather scant. This is not Lizardman sign. This has actually been proven to be these tracks, which were cast, I believe, in the 90s, have been proven to be a hoax because they're actually 100% identical to each other. And I guess you can make uniformity of how this track looks. There's no animal in the animal kingdom that would look like this. There's nothing natural that looks like this. And to be fair to the anatomy part of all of this, it's also completely broken anatomy. This kind of foot would not support a bipedal animal whatsoever. Just would not happen. The laws of physics don't allow that. We also have these tracks, actually. These are not actually very often talked about. These are tracks that were found at the Marshall's residence in 2011. The Marshall couple were, or are, I should say, a couple who kind of were at the center of one of the Lizardman crazes back in the 2010s because their car was attacked one night. And the car sustained substantial damage to the rims, and it was sort of said, oh, it's the Lizardman. Have these sort of round triangle pads and the toes that come off of it. They also look incomplete. Perhaps that's because they're in this kind of weird cracked mud area. Some of the holes might be part of mud cracks that we can't really interpret now. And we do have this image of the car right here, the front of it. And it's been proven physically that unsolved mystery, but it's kind of leaning towards canine, so we can't really be part of our list. So unfortunately, we're kind of left with saying, well, perhaps this thing's leaving no sign right now. But there's still kind of hope for those who'd like there to be a Lizardman, because, well, for a plethora of reasons, but partially in this particular small context, because we have the bonus of seeing some very, you might say, peculiar and specific behavior. So again, here we have Chris Davis's infamous drawing. And it would be very interesting for us to kind of take a quick analytical look at this. It's got a humanoid form, but it also has these kind of, these long tapering shoulders, and it does look very much like Chris Davis meant to draw these things as tapering, because it almost, if you look at it, it almost looks like he drew the torso first and then the arms. So he was kind of connecting dots a bit while he was drawing this. We have these kind of stocky legs with a very strange waistline. It's not really a normal-looking waistline. It's not something you would expect to see in a naturally, we'll say, bipedal animal, although naturally is kind of feet. It's possible that grass were hiding the feet, or water might have been, and he just didn't get a look at it. Again, his sighting happened allegedly in the evening, and there's kind of surrounding circumstances that suggest Chris Davis probably wasn't pulling anyone's leg. So, well, that's interesting to consider. And he's got these three-toed claws, three-fingered claws, and he has this very strange diamond-shaped head with these large eyes and this kind of gaping mouth. Very thin neck. A lot of weird tapering on this animal. And here's, this kind of more dramatic representation. And what's interesting is this dramatic representation is undoubtedly more accurate to what Chris Davis drew and described than Carnufex or a similar animal to Carnufex would be. So while I've made the point that there's similar animals to the Lizardman that have existed before, I haven't really argued that Lizardman is particularly one of them. I would like to draw your attention to this art that I've done, and it's not particularly good art. In fact, it's actually rather inaccurate, but it'll suffice for now. It's a rough sketch of Carnufex, or a Carnufex-like animal, let's say. And here we have it, on all fours, and there we have it standing upright. Now, I've definitely kind of misinterpreted what the legs would look like. They'd likely be a bit shorter and stockier, and there'd be less of a smooth transition from the torso to the legs. But it's roughly accurate. That is roughly what you would see if you saw a standing Carnufex or similar animal staring at you. And, there's some interesting features here. We have this tail that kind of would have probably been either dragging on the ground behind it a bit by the tip, or it would have been straight outward, perhaps, although the dragging is a bit probably more accurate because it stands up when it's on all fours. We have these short, stocky arms. We have this kind of strange neck, because it, to face forward, has to kind of lean forward as its head protrudes from its neck, and it's got this crest on it. We actually know Carnifex had this crest on its head. It might have been for attracting mates. So we get this very strange image that looks very different from what it looks like from the side. I'd like to argue, not definitively, but I'd like to argue that perhaps we are looking, if a lizard man exists, at a similar image here. Let's say you saw the image on the right, very late at night, in the flash of a flashlight in a few seconds in the headlights. Granted, humans are actually our brains are really quite interpretive, and we are very good at spotting things. But at night and in flashes of light, maybe not so much. And let's say you had, pretty considerably not developed drawing skills. I would argue that the sort of optical illusion of the diamond-shaped head, because of the crest and the eyes, and the three-fingered claws, and the upright posture with the strange waist that looks like it's not naturally upright, what might be being drawn here is actually the optical illusion created by seeing a Carnifex-like reptile facing you. Of course, that isn't a definitive point, not by any means, and there's a lot wrong with it. You could argue that this is wrong all day. But it makes just enough of a point, I would say. It has just enough similarities to really, I think, be a very significant interpretation of the art. So we've kind of discussed why the lizard man, not only why it might exist at this nexus of scientific fields, but also the fact that it does in certain ways, and what those ways can actually help us understand more about the case. We know now that that diet would work and that habit might not work, but we're not too sure on that yet. That requires further research. We've identified where further research is needed, and we have been able to kind of roughly glaze over and conclude some of the other research. Paleontology has allowed us to know that one or more species of semi-bipedal crocodilian predators used to exist within the same region as modern-day scape or swamp. And likewise, wildlife biology has taught us that we know this species existed in a similar environment and climate to modern-day scape or swamp, and that its behavior made for unprecedented similarities to the reports of the lizard man's anatomy. Now, of course, it would be very unscientific to not divulge the many holes in this. Paleontology, as much as it tells us positively about lizard men, let's say, also shows us that we know these and similar prehistoric species died out hundreds of millions of years ago, and that changes the Earth has undergone since then makes the survival of Carnifex and other similar predators across the millions of years since the Triassic rather unlikely. Wildlife biology has also taught us that we know to expect traces of animals as they exist in their environment, and a hypothetical species similar to Carnifex in the region of Scape or Swamp or Bishopville or Lee County or even North Carolina has yet to really provide those definitive or at least perplexing traces. Now, of course, we discussed the reasons why that might be the case, but it's certainly the case that's still yet to be presented, so we're still left with a few holes because we haven't really considered, let's say the statistics of why people would even be reporting this. What are the reasons people do? And how many people really are reporting this? How many people are talking about the Bishopville lizard man like it's a real thing? And, numbers might lend that some credibility. The statistics of the sightings are very, very important to understanding whether people are actually taking this seriously or not. And, of course, psychology is another very interesting thing because even just the misinterpretation of an optical illusion is a very deeply psychological phenomenon because we're wired to look for patterns. So why are things being misinterpreted if we're misinterpreting a Carnufex-like animal or another object or even another person? Why are we misinterpreting them? And of course, that links to neurology. Why is it that our brains misinterpret things? Why would that happen as a conscious behavior? And those are questions we haven't even answered in this presentation because, well, it would take hours, is mostly why. So it's very important, really, to take a look at this kind of thing because we need to understand this. We need to understand this phenomenon. There's definitely a Lizardman phenomenon. Whether it's psychological, metaphysical, as some would believe, or a real wildlife-oriented zoological phenomenon isn't really known yet. It's definitely a cultural phenomenon in some ways because it's been interpreted into culture, and it's definitely the case that, I mean, if you want evidence that it's a cultural phenomenon or a psychological phenomenon, even if it's real, look at what you're doing right now. You're sitting here watching this presentation. That's the evidence right there for that. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this presentation today. I think that this is a very important... I think crypto connectivity is very important for understanding sciences because we can't just build a scientific examination from the ground up with nothing. That can't be done. We need building blocks, and I think it's time that we all start looking to these already known facts about reality to help us understand things that aren't so clear about reality. Like, I hope everyone enjoyed. Some particularly. And hope everyone's enjoying the festival as well so far because it seems like it's a rather really, enjoyable event, and I'm glad that I got to be a part of it. Alright, if there are no questions, that will do for now. I believe this presentation is going to be up at some point later today to re-watch if need be, and I will also be uploading it in a different format. So I hope everyone enjoyed, and I hope to see you all very soon in other presentations, and I hope everyone's enjoying their day. Thank you for attending.